Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Hard One Islamic Study Circle, HISC Seerah session 229. The recap of the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Last week we did session 24. We talked about the open stage of dawah, moving from Darul Arkam to the process of inviting people on banquets and then going to the top of Mount Safa, and then the backlash that he received from the ruling elite of Makkah, where Makkah perceived the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims as an existential threat. Session 26 was recapping how the Quraish set up a think tank to develop a propaganda strategy against the Prophet ﷺ. One of the things they instituted early on was a public ban on the recitation of the Qur'an near the Kaaba by the Prophet ﷺ. And so then he would recite it at night time in his own house. The next stage was propaganda was making fun of the Prophet ﷺ, mocking him, belittling him, and bullying the Prophet ﷺ, and more about that later. And then also the next part of the sort of ideological struggle was a misdirection and character assassination from the Quraish against the Prophet ﷺ. So moving on to continuing the backlash, session 29 recap. So the ideological struggle between the Prophet ﷺ and the Quraysh continued. The Prophet ﷺ was predominantly attacking the values and social and civilisational norms of society of the ruling elite in Makkah, knowing that Makkah is a tribal society and protecting it is through these tribal allegiances. The Prophet ﷺ, he was attacking those things. So various tribal factions sent a very high-level delegation to Abu Talib, who was the leader of Banu Hashim, and he was the tribal leader, the tribal elder, so things would go through him if anything needed to be sorted out in his tribe, because we mentioned it's a tribal society. And so they were arguing with the process with Abu Talib. The Prophet ﷺ is disrupting their social norms. He's agitating the community through his implicit cursing of their gods and their forefathers, when in reality, the Prophet ﷺ was criticizing their current way of life and their current social normative values. And so this delegation implored Abu Talib to stop his nephew, or there may be consequences. So then Abu Talib returns back to the Prophet ﷺ, and he tries to essentially emotionally blackmail the Prophet ﷺ, saying, look, you don't want to make things difficult for me. This is what they've said. And then the Prophet ﷺ replied, saying that he essentially can't stop giving this call, this invitation, this warning, because that's his job now. And then there's a couple of famous instances where he says, look, you can no longer, I can't stop this, and even if you were to give me the sun and the moon in my hands, or if you were to sort of go towards the sun yourself and sort of light this stick, it can't be done, essentially. And so on hearing this and seeing the Prophet ﷺ's resolve, Abu Talib, who loved the Prophet almost as his own son, allowed the Prophet ﷺ to carry on preaching with his full protection and his full blessing, and that's what he informed the Quraysh elite, the Mullah. So then they came back, and then the next offer from the Quraysh elite to try and find a solution or find a way out that would maintain Abu Talib's dignity as tribal leader, but would give them a way around this, was they would offer a straight swap of the kids of the nobles. So whereby Al-Walid ibn Mughira, sort of one of the top leaders, we've talked about Al-Walid before, he would give up his favorite son to Abu Talib. So Abu Talib can formally adopt him as a son. And then the Prophet ﷺ would be given up in exchange to them. So obviously Abu Talib, he rejects this insulting offer by saying what they propose is essentially he looks after one, Al-Walid's son, whilst they would go on and kill the other, and says this is no way that he's going to accept that. And then we've talked before that there was a wise man amongst them, Al-Mutim ibn Adi, who tried to sort of compromise, and he then suggested to Abu Talib that it's best in his best interest if he accepts this offer. and Motim was really well respected by everyone. And Motim's the chap who negotiated the peace almost when they were rebuilding the Kaaba. And so Motim says this is a way out whilst we can maintain our historic norms and social values. But then Abu Talib gets angry. He realizes and he says, look, this is a pre-planned conspiracy that you guys have concocted in order to sort of get him to do these things. So then he rejects that and leaves. And no doubt that strengthened his resolve to support his nephew. And again, just remember that Abu Talib's full brother was Abdullah, and obviously the Prophet was the son of Abdullah, and so there was this special bond between Abu Talib and the Prophet. The next session, session 30, we talked about some of the miracles and compromise offers that the Quraysh had. So again, another part of their strategy to delegitimize the Prophet and his message. So they started demanding proof of prophethood from the Prophet by challenging him to undertake miracles. And then they also attempted to bribe him or offer compromise offers. And then we started off actually the study circle talking about having a cup of water. I know it's difficult now during Ramadan, but having a cup of water, and would people drink the cup of water? And obviously people would drink the cup of water. If the cup of water was half water, half urine, would people drink that? Obviously, most people would not drink that. And then if you had the cup of water and put a few drops of urine in, would people drink that? Because it's obviously been corrupted with the urine. And again, most people would not drink that water. And the analogy is, how much are we as Muslims willing to compromise our Islam with a lot of kufr or a bit of kufr? And it's the struggle that we face constantly here living in the West, where we're asked to compromise certain parts of Islam in order to appease the people around us, our peers and society and social norms. And so the question is for us all, how much are we willing to dilute Islam, to put filth in Islam and still try to justify that? And again, that's sort of the backdrop of some of the following conversations. But going back to some of the miracles that the elite, they demanded, partly through sheer arrogance and trying to set up unnecessary obstacles, they asked the Prophet ﷺ to create rivers around Makkah so that they could prosper like the Persian civilizations who had the Euphrates and the Tigris. Can't the Prophet ﷺ magic up rivers around Makkah? Because Makkah is such a barren landscape, they said, well, can't you provide us with exotic gardens and exotic fruits like grapes so that we can sort of live properly? Another thing that they said was, it's a very mountainous landscape around Makkah. Why can't you just move the mountains, physically move the mountains, if you can do that sort of stuff? Another challenge was to turn Mount Safa into pure gold. Now, this actually, the Prophet was thinking, well, maybe if he could ask Allah to turn Mount Safa into gold, this would, demonstrate his prophethood and the people would believe in him. So he's actually having this internal conversation, and then he sort of, asks Jibril to Allah about this, and then Allah then replies that he's willing to do this, but there has to be an ultimatum. If upon seeing this miracle of Mount Safa being turned into gold, and they still don't believe in Islam, then they will be destroyed. And the Prophet ﷺ then declined to offer up this as a miracle, because he'd rather work on his people rather than see them destroyed if they didn't believe in the miracle after that happened. Finally, and we're all aware of the other great miracle the Prophet ﷺ did, which was upon, again, challenging the Quraysh. Said, well, why can't you split the moon? And he goes, okay, fine, with Allah's permission. He gathered everyone one evening, clear night, and the moon he motioned towards it, and it split with either side of it being on either side of Mount Safa, and then it came back together in front of their very eyes. Yeah, and you'd thought that this would have convinced them. However, those that didn't want to believe, haters going to be haters essentially, they didn't believe, and they further accused the Prophet ﷺ of bewitching their eyes as a way to explain away this phenomenon which they all clearly saw. And again, this really brought home to the Prophet ﷺ how much enmity the Quraysh had to their message. Then we also talked about another occurrence where Utbah ibn Rabia, he came sort of excitedly to the Prophet ﷺ and said, look, the elite, we've all finally decided to make you an offer. And the Prophet ﷺ, he gathered up his things, he was quite enthusiastic, and he thought, well, maybe there's something in this, maybe they've heard, and reconsidered, and he rushed to the Nadwa where they're all sat, sort of their sort of main town hall, the parliament area. Then when he got there, Utbah, he then turned around to them and said, basically, to the Prophet, you're a troublemaker. You curse our life. You curse our forefathers. You curse our gods. You cause disharmony amongst the families. You are a truly evil Arab. No one ever has been as bad as you for his people. However, and this is how he started his negotiation, however, we've all decided to make you a compromise offer so that you would stop your preaching. And basically the compromise offer was, if you want money, we'll gather up all the money and wealth that we have, and you can become the richest amongst us. If it's power you want, then we'll make you king, so you can rule over us. And again, the kingship was a new phenomenon for them. They've seen it in other places. They have a very different tribal structure, but they were willing to change all of that and say, we're willing to make you rule over us as king, if that's what you want. If you want women, then you can choose the 10 best women that we have here in Makkah, and we can divorce them if you like, and you can have them. And if you're ill, then we can find the best doctors to cure you. And the Prophet ﷺ obviously rejected all of what they were saying. So then in the gathering, they said they further publicly mocked the Prophet ﷺ, and again by reiterating some of those outlandish asks, like saying, oh, well, why don't you flatten the lands around us and remove the mountains? Why can't you even bring the angels down from the heavens in front of us? Or another one was, why can't you resurrect our ancestor Qusay so he can vouch for you? And Qusay is obviously the great-great-great-grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ. And you talk about the lineage, it goes back to Qusay, who kicked out the tribe of Jurham and brought back the Quraysh to Makkah. Why don't you resurrect Qusay so that he can vouch for you? Or why don't you create castles of gold and silver, and sort of mocking him like this? And they said, well, if you can't do any of that, then bring the punishment that you keep threatening us with, bring that down. And they're all sort of laughing amongst themselves. And the Prophet says, look, that's not what I've been brought for, and then he went away quite dejected from that meeting. As he's going away dejected from that meeting, his first cousin runs up to him, Abdullah ibn Umayyah, and the Prophet turns around, and Abdullah comes up to him and says, look, he sort of further, rather than consoling the Prophet, he further adds insult to injury by asking him, look, this was a really good offer, you should have taken it. Why don't you bring a ladder that goes up to the heavens and climb? I want to see you climb up the ladder, go to heaven, go to Allah, ask Allah to write a letter of commendation for you, come down from heavens with that letter of commendation, accompanied by angels, attesting to your prophethood. Then maybe I might become a Muslim. Actually, no, even if that happens, I'm not going to become a Muslim. So you can see the type of mockery and belittling that they did the Prophet, as well as asking him to do these outlandish miracles. The next session, session 31, we talked about some of the torture that started. And again, this is the next sort of upping the ante against the Muslims. And the Prophet, as we've mentioned, was initially protected from direct physical torture through his uncle's, Abu Talib's, tribal protection. However, some of the other nobles, and especially those of the lower social caste or slaves, didn't have that level of protection and were more prone to torture. And again, defining torture as inflicting physical and or psychological pain on people to get them to sort of change their ways or their values. The most vicious, we've talked about some of the most vicious people who were foremost in the torturing were people like Abu Lahab, Abu Jahl, and Umayyah bin Khalaf. Some of the people who were tortured, we talked about some of their stories, like a couple of those from noble backgrounds were tortured, notably Uthman ibn Affan. He was from one of the noble families of Bani Umayyah. They used to wrap him up in a carpet made up of sort of palm fibers, etc., and then they would jump on him and crush him whilst he's inside that sort of rolled up carpet-like thing. And again, that's why Uthman, being a nobleman, was given permission to go to migration to Abyssinia later on. Inshallah, we'll do that. Then another famous rich person, noble from noble stock, Musab ibn Umair. He was rich, he was trendy, he was young. He was first denied his allowance, and then his mother did some emotional blackmail on him. We talked about this before. Did emotional blackmail by going on hunger strike. Stop worshipping Allah, or I'll starve myself to death. And as she's sort of getting towards the end of her hunger strike, he said, look, you can go on hunger strike 100 times and come back from dead 100 times. I'm still not going to worship your gods. So then, she broke a hunger strike, and then they started starving Musab, then beating him up, locking him up, and trying to expel him. So again, and that's why one of the reasons why Musab ibn Umair was chosen to be one of the people, or the person to teach the people of Yathrib Islam later on. Then some of the slaves, they got a very rough time, and a lot of people know of Sumayya and Yasir, the first people to be martyred in Islam. They were the slaves of Abu Jahl, and Abu Jahl was particularly cruel towards his slaves. And when the Prophet would see Yasir and Sumayya being tortured, he would just say, "Be patient, you will be in paradise." There's not much else he could do other than try to give them some glad tidings. But the slaves, it's just a recognition that slaves always have been expensive. They're a very expensive commodity to have, even in those days. And so these slave owners, they're treading a very thin line between, torturing their slaves and not killing their slaves, because again, they're very, very expensive. And so they would torture them to the brink almost, let them recover, do some of their sort of slave activities, and then start re-torturing them again. So there would be this cycle. But on one occasion, it's said that Sumayya, after being tortured, said something harsh towards Abu Jahl, said a bad word towards him. So then Abu Jahl, he started torturing her and took a spear, and he killed her by driving it in through her private parts. And as part of the torture, he killed Sumayya, he killed Yasir, and he made their son Ammar watch the torture, and then forced him, and he's a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, forced him to recant his belief. And as a teenager, seeing his parents being killed, he buckled and he denounced the Prophet ﷺ. So then later, Ammar bin Yasir, he ran to the Prophet ﷺ and explained what had happened, and the Prophet ﷺ said that, what you said, is it what was in your heart? And Ammar says, no, I still believe in Allah and the message. And then the Prophet ﷺ, through Allah's permission, gave them permission to say things under duress, so long as your heart is steadfast on Allah. But he said it's better not to say those things. But obviously, if you're an extreme duress, and this is the definition of duress, then it is permissible to say those. Other stories that we talked about, and again, everyone knows of Bilal bin Rabah, the Abyssinian slave. They used to put a rope around his neck, drag him through the streets, put him on the hot sand in the desert, lay rocks on him, and then when they would do that, he would say, "Ahadun ahad, ahadun ahad, Allah is one, Allah is one." And the more they torture him, the louder he would say that. And later on, they asked Bilal, "Well, why would you say Ahadun ahad?" And Bilal says, well, that it would make my torturers the angriest if I said that. So they're trying to torture him. So he's winding them up by saying Allah is one, because he found that's the thing that really got them even more riled up. He was eventually purchased by Abu Bakr and then freed. And Abu Bakr, he also freed another slave who was tortured in a similar way, Abu Faqih, from Bani Abdul Dar. And again, this other slave used to be dragged through the streets by ropes along his feet. Again, Abu Bakr freed him as well. Another person who used to dish out the torturing was Umar ibn al-Khattab. So before he became a Muslim, there's stories of him routinely torturing his female slaves. He would torture them, and then he would rest, watch them, have something to eat, and then get back to re-torturing them. And again, he was well known for his hatred of Islam, so much so that when he did actually say a good word again for the Muslims, so there's some people packing up to go to Abyssinia, he said, basically something like, may your journey be easy. And then this woman came back to her husband and said, look, Umar, he said this, he may become a Muslim. And the husband said there's more chance of Umar's donkey becoming a Muslim than him becoming a Muslim, because he was well known for his hatred of Islam. Another person who was tortured a lot was Khabbab bin Arat. He was a blacksmith and a sword maker. He was tortured by his female owner. She would get kids to beat him up, drag him. He was dragged through the streets by his hair. He was dragged over fire again as a torture. Because he's a blacksmith, they would cauterize or burn his skin with his own tools. They would lay him on the hot sand, and then they would put rocks in his blacksmith furnace, take the hot rocks from the blacksmith's furnace and put them on his back. And he said, I could feel and hear the rocks burning into his flesh on his back, and again, that was one of the ways he was tortured. Through this, he asked the Prophet ﷺ, when will this end? On one occasion, when the Prophet ﷺ was leaned up against the Kaaba, and the Prophet ﷺ got a bit angry with Khabbab, even though he knew the torture that Khabbab was going through. And the Prophet ﷺ famously responded, people before you used to be combed with iron combs that would strip the flesh off their bones, and people would be sawn in half, so be patient. Obviously, being tortured, that's not what you want to hear, but that's all the Prophet ﷺ could do. The next session, session 32, we talked about another strategy that the Quraish and the elite had. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he is claiming to be a prophet, this concept of prophethood is not something which is ingrained amongst the Arabs. They know that the Jews have this concept of prophethood, so they sent a delegation to Medina, where it's known the Jews were living, and they said, tell us about prophethood, and we've got somebody who claims to be prophet. We don't know anything about prophets. And so one of the things they said to him was, ask him about Yusuf. Does he know anything about Yusuf? And again, some say that's when Surah Yusuf was revealed. There's another delegation that was sent to Medina to try and basically say, can you get us some way of tricking the Prophet ﷺ, or finding out if he's a real prophet or not? So this sort of high-level delegation went from the Quraish, met some high-level rabbis in Medina, and they basically said, why don't you ask him these three questions? Ask him, and if he is a real prophet, he'll tell you the answer. And one of these was a trick question. Ask him about the men in the cave, ask him about the man who traveled from the east to the west, and ask him what is the ruh, or the spirit. And so they told him what the answers would be, and they came back hurriedly and said to the Prophet, okay, if you are a prophet, tell us about the men in the cave, tell us about the man who traveled from the east to the west, and tell us what is the ruh. And so the Prophet, when he heard these three questions, he said, okay, fine, I'll tell you later, come back tomorrow. And obviously, that we all know the story, because the Prophet didn't say, Insha'Allah, I'll tell you. And so the next day happened, no response from Allah. The next day, and the next day. A week went by, no response. People are laughing, making fun of him. He said, come back. He doesn't know the answer. And then it went on for another week. So over 2 weeks later, then the response came from Allah, and the response came in Surah Al-Kahf, which we read every Friday, or we should read every Friday. The response came in Surah Kahf. And again, one of the lessons is, if anything is going to happen in the future, you should always, as Muslims say, inshallah, by the permission of Allah. So, He has control over everything that happens. So anything that happens in the future, say inshallah. And this was a way to teach the Prophet this lesson, despite the mocking he was giving. And to the Prophet, he told them about the story in Surah Kahf of the men in the cave. He told them about Dhul Qarnayn, the man who traveled from the east and west, and the person who blocked up the Yajuj and Majuj. And with regards to the ruh, he said, and it's in the Qur'an, that we cannot as human beings know it, and this is a secret only for Allah. And the rabbi said, if he tries to explain what the ruh is, that he is a fraud, because he's only trying to please the people, because nobody but Allah knows what the ruh is. And so that is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said. So that was the response. The response there. Then sort of we're getting on to the next set of issues, which is around persecution. So session 33, we talked about some of the persecution techniques of the Quraysh. But before that, we also talked about some of the other ways in which the Quraysh would try to do anti-Muslim propaganda. One of the things was that they said that these stories, and again, they're belittling the Qur'an by calling these are just stories that he's making up. And then Allah retorts in the Qur'an, these aren't stories that he's making up. These are things that are related to him by Jibreel morning and evening. So Allah responds to that accusation that these are just mere stories. And again, to counter these so-called mere stories, because they saw people listening to the stories of Bani Israel and the previous nations. So what they did was they sent another bin Haris to Persia to learn stories, ancient Persian history from the Persians, and to come back, and that's what he did. He learned these stories of ancient Persian history and their heroes, and he would come back and he would then try to set up a rival stall next to the Prophet, telling him his stories. He says, don't listen to his stories, come to my stories. My stories are better. And again, they're trying to attract people away from the Prophet. And again, Allah responds to this and says, don't listen to this idle talk that these people have to distract the people. Again, we talked about how the Prophet is from a noble class. Another thing that happened against him and his family was Abu Lahab, forced his sons to divorce their wives, and two of his sons married two of the daughters of the Prophet, Ruqayya and Kulthum, and they were ordered by Abu Lahab to divorce their wives, and again, as a way of getting back at the Prophet, or trying to humiliate him and using whatever lever of social pressure that they have. Another stories that we know of, Abu Lahab and his wife would throw pebbles and stones at the Prophet, sometimes quite a lot, that he would actually start bleeding with that. Abu Lahab's wife and some of the other ladies, they would get some of the thorns, crush up the thorns and throw it in the path of the Prophet, so where he would walk. His route from where he lives to the Kaaba is well known, so they would put thorns in his path. On one occasion, Abu Lahab's wife went she got particularly riled up, and she went to pelt the Prophet ﷺ with some stones and really do him injury. And the Prophet ﷺ was walking with Abu Bakr, and Abu Lahab's wife came. She couldn't find the Prophet ﷺ, so she started mouthing off at Abu Bakr, and then Abu Bakr turned around to the Prophet and said, "What was all that about?" And the Prophet said, "Allah, this is what she was going to do. Allah made me invisible to her." So rather than her throwing stones at the Prophet, she basically, he was made invisible to her. We all know stories of how people would throw garbage in front of the Prophet ﷺ or in front of his house or as he's going to the Kaaba. And again, it's a hot country and there's garbage. This is, putrid, festering stuff that they would just throw in his path. He'd have to sort of clear a path, get a stick and clear a path for him to walk through this. And he says, to the people, Banu Abdul Manaf, is this a way to treat your kin, essentially? And then we talked, famously before about the story of, and this probably happened later on when Abu Talib died, where 7 of the Quraish were sitting in the Nadwa, and Abu Jahl, he challenged anyone to go and throw some camel intestines on the Prophet ﷺ whilst he's praying. And Uqba ibn Abiyah, he went in all his finery, gathered up the innards of the camels, despite wearing his best robes, and he brought them back. And as the Prophet ﷺ was doing sajda, he dumped them on the Prophet ﷺ whilst he's in the sajda, in a sort of frenzy to please his friends. And because this is Uqba and the nobles doing this to the Prophet ﷺ, no one else can intervene. None of the slaves or any of the other nobles, they can't intervene because this is inter-noble rivalry. And so somebody goes and fetches the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, Fatma, who's again, probably early teens or maybe 10 years old at the time. She comes and cleans the mess. And the Prophet ﷺ then, when he comes up from that, famously, he makes that dua where he curses those people, and then he curses them one by one and asks Allah to bring his punishment on each of those individuals one by one. And the person who narrates the story says, by Allah, I saw all of them die at the Battle of Badr. And as the Prophet, he's making this dua against them one by one, all of their faces turn white, because they know when the Prophet says something, it happens, that he speaks the truth. So that's enough for now. Inshallah, next time we'll talk more about some of the persecution against the Muslims and the Prophet, and then also due to the persecution, the Prophet gives permission for some of the followers to go to Abyssinia, and then we'll talk about Abyssinia, the satanic verses, and then some of the stories in Abyssinia, inshallah. So again, inshallah, do remember in your du'as. I hope everyone's Ramadan is going well and it is fruitful. So until next time, والأسر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم.